Hi, everyone. My name is Shay McNally, Digital Marketing Project Lead with R3 Continuum. Our presentation today is going to cover a topic that is likely new to some of you, but we feel it's a really important topic to address based on the trends that we're seeing within the workplace right now. Over the last few years, even before the pandemic, our personal and professional lives have been facing increased disruption. When I say disruption, what I'm referencing is natural disasters, political and civil unrest, workplace violence, the pandemic, loss of loved ones and colleagues, and the list goes on. This has been occurring at an increased rate, hitting our work environments like waves hitting a shoreline. We call this systemic disruption, and it's becoming our new normal. So to get into our presenter today, we have one of our systemic disruption experts, Jeff Gorter, Vice President of Crisis Response Clinical Services. Jeff has over 30 years of clinical experience, including consultation and extensive on-site critical incident response to businesses and communities. He's directly responded to the September 11th attacks, Hurricane Katrina, multiple mass shootings, and many, many more. So thank you for being with us today, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shane. And welcome to all of you as well as you joined.
So getting right into it, because I know this is a hefty topic, but let's just start kind of with a, kind of an overview. So when we're referencing disruption, the saying is all disruption is human disruption. So what exactly do you mean by that? And why is that important for business leaders to think in that way about disruption?
Well, I think it's important to start at the beginning. You're absolutely right, because I think, when we think all disruption is a human disruption, all crisis is a human crisis, that might seem like sort of an obvious statement. But for many business leaders, when a crisis happens, when a disruption strikes their workplace, they go into, I'll just call it leader mode. It's about problem solving. It's about consequence management. And so they're thinking about what business continuity challenges does this situation bring? What legal exposure might this bring? How can we return to productivity as quickly as it can? All solid and very understandable business objectives, and one that we support. But the reality is, it doesn't matter how soon I get the lights back up or the trucks rolling again if the people sitting at that terminal or driving that vehicle are not emotionally ready to be back. If they have not been attended to, cared for, if they do not know that the company gets it, that will have a severe and deleterious impact on the company, because you're going to have folks who are not wanting to work. You're going to have folks who are working in a perhaps unsafe way, and you're going to have folks who are working but angry and disgruntled because they feel like this thing just happened. And if all I heard from from leadership was, well, it's all over now, get back to work, that is going to be perceived as an indication of a company that doesn't get it and doesn't care.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, we touched on it a little bit before, but disruption can be so many different things and can impact people in so many different ways. But while we're kind of keep on going here, let's touch on today's the title of our webinar. So can you explain what exactly systemic disruption is?
Sure. And systemic disruption is what I contend is a reflection, a change that has occurred. It used to be that we would prepare and be ready for sporadic disruption, for the idea that once in a while something unusual, something unexpected would happen. And so we'd be planning for it. We'd be ready for it. And quite frankly, these were situations that were driven by the event that just happened. So for example, here's something that many folks, particularly those who were around during 9/11, would remember. Following the terrorist attacks in New York City on 9/11, almost all organizations put together terrorist response plans. They put together plans to respond. If such a thing were to happen again, we have this ready. And then a few years later, Katrina hit. And they came to realize those plans were virtually worthless. They didn't apply to this. There's a shelf life for disaster plans like that. It's about 6 months. And there's no value in being an expert on the last disaster. Systemic disruption means we have to be prepared for what will inevitably be coming our way. The idea that disruption is on its way. We don't know what it is. It's not that we're asking people to psychically forecast what the next crisis is going to be, but it is in our own best interest to be ready for, to plan for, to know that it is coming, and to have a strategy that manages the human impact, as we just talked about. Because if I have a solid IT plan that would help me manage a disruption in my tech services, great. But if the disruption impacted my people, and I don't have a strategy for managing that, it doesn't matter how quickly they get back online.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting point. I was pretty young when 9/11 happened, but I do remember my mom worked in Minneapolis, and there was tons of plans before anybody felt comfortable to go back to the buildings. And like you said, there's not a hurricane up here, but then an event happened where maybe a coworker died, and it just isn't it doesn't work. It's not a one size fits all, as we'll kind of get into later on in the presentation as well. Following that up, kind of how is systemic disruption different than acute disruption? I apologize. It looks like I interrupted you there. So
no, that's perfect. No, that I think, so an acute disruption there are singular events. There are events that are unique and occur and will likely not happen again. But it's not the incident that drives it, it's the impact. And I think that's what we mean by systemic, is that the impact becomes cumulative. I think if we think back over the last 5 years, we've seen that there has been a almost constant flow. The breaks between mass events, whether it's a shooting, whether it's a wildfire, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's COVID or civil unrest, we'll see as in just a few slides that it's been constant. And when I look back historically, there used to be a fairly significant amount of time between events of this nature. But where we are now, for whatever reason, we are in a place where these things are occurring with greater frequency. The kinds of things that are occurring have greater intensity, and the events themselves are more unique. They are unexpected. They are not sort of standard types of crises that one could expect. They are ones that take us completely by surprise and are unexpected. And so it's the intensity, frequency, and uniqueness has changed.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect point to lead into the next slide, which I think goes into what you were just discussing. And that's, the last few years, you've done some research into the cases that R3 Continuum has responded to. And so here's kind of the graph that we were looking at. So talk to us kind of about a little bit more what this data tells us as it relates to disruptions in the workplace.
No, thanks. And before I dive into that, in being true to what we stated, that every disruption is a human disruption, I just want to pause for a moment and just acknowledge, as we look at data, as we look at numbers here, it is not lost on me that every one of these events, because what we're going to look at is how many events did we as R3 Continuum respond to, provide support to, and that after every one of these events, it's not about events, it's not about numbers, it's about people. Each one of these situations is about employees who went through what for them might have been the worst day of their lives. And so I want to be cautious. I want to be respectful of the fact that when we look at numbers, as a researcher once said, statistics are numbers with the tears wiped away. And I don't in any way want to minimize or take it for granted that these numbers are not with power for people, because many of these struck so many of us on this webinar right now. Now, having said that, what occurred to me as I was kind of getting at before is that it just struck me that something has changed, something was different. And when I looked back over the last 10 years, I found what I thought was a striking pattern. So the chart here that you see highlights the number of shifts, which is to say the number of times in which we deployed a trained behavioral health specialist to go on site to a workplace to provide support following a disruption or a crisis event. And when I look back from 2012, that's where it begins at the left side, And through 2022, and I know we're not done with 2022 yet, but I wanted to look at the last 10 years to see what the pattern shows. And when we start at 2012 and we go to about 2017, you'll see that the number of events were fairly consistent. It kind of operated in a relatively straight trend line. You could see ups and downs. Of course, there were significant events. There were large mass events that occurred during that period, undoubtedly. And so those represent the spikes, the rises of times when it occurred. But it was relatively consistent in that trend line. But beginning 2017, and I kind of went back and I looked through our records, it basically starting with Hurricane Harvey that struck Houston and leveled so much devastation, and then continuing to February 14, Valentine's Day of 2018, which is when the Parkland shooting occurred. And that in that 20-month period of time, there were 17 mass events that occurred. 17 mass events in a 20-month period of time. And by that, I mean, again, there were multiple hurricanes. There were multiple wildfires. That's kind of when that consistent addition to the summer months in western states. Suddenly, wildfires were breaking out all over and having significant damage. It's when, again, mass shootings occurred. There were so many events that occurred during that period of time that it was almost one a month. And as you'll see, the trend line did not return. It did not drop back down to previous levels. It's difficult, I know, on this chart to see. But if you look ahead then, 2019, we're talking about the El Paso shootings. We're talking about the destruction of the town of Paradise, California, in the wildfires, events that we all knew about that were, to put them bluntly, these are CNN-level events, ones that are on the news and are on the news for a period of time that grip the nation's attention. And it continued. And then getting up to 2020, that spike, no surprise, the one that is just under 10,000, represents all the cases that we responded to following the outbreak of COVID-19 and the impact that it had on not just the U.S., but on the globe. But all of this, that line represents all the services we provided on behalf of healthcare organizations and so many other businesses in order to stay operational during that period of time. There was a brief lull in there, and then the second spike is what we call civil unrest, the racial injustice protests that occurred following the death of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. But again, that was something that occurred all across the U.S. The civil unrest, the protests were everywhere. There was almost all towns experienced some level of that. Then that was quickly followed by the most divisive political season in memory, culminating with the breaching of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th and continuing with the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision with the Supreme Court most recently. Again, all of those situations feeding into a sense of civil unrest and discontent in the country one way or another. And so that lines continue to show that something has changed and it has spiked up. And when I looked at it, that period of time from 2012 to 2017, that first section that you see, the normal flat trend line, R3 responded around 63,000 times on behalf of EAP, Employee Assistance Programs, and corporations directly, 63,000 times. From 2017 to 2022, and we're not done with this year yet, we have responded over 115,000 times, more than double that previous period of time. And again, I highlight, you can say, well, of course, with COVID, that makes sense, sure. But again, the trend began pre-COVID. It predated COVID, and there was already an increase occurring in disruptions. And that number, I think, the fact that it has doubled and that the consistency, the number of spikes, as you can see, if we look at those as significant events that required a tremendous outpouring of resources and deploying of our consultants to respond and cope with these situations, has changed and it has increased. So my contention is that it's no longer, the occasional blip on a otherwise consistent trend. It is disruption has become the new normal. It's a systemic situation rather than occasional sporadic.
Yeah, and I think that when mapping out just what's happened over the last couple of years, kind of just put it into perspective of me is like, you're right. Like those things each happened kind of one after another, and each pretty different in one another. Like you said, they're not the same. And you mentioned, yes, we've had an increase and a majority were the COVID cases in the R3 Continuum shift, but again, a disruption that nobody really thought was going to happen. I mean, I never even really imagined that in my lifetime I'd be living in a pandemic, yet there we were in March, and it's just crazy to think about all of that and how much that's really impacted. So pretty daunting numbers, but important.
Exactly. And it highlights my statement earlier that the intensity, the frequency, and the uniqueness of the events is utterly different from previous experiences.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I think that goes right into our next slide very well. And we've talked about this before in past presentations, but it's too good and it makes the most sense. So referencing disruption and what leadership should be looking for, kind of an interesting way to talk about black swans and gray rhinos. So can you kind of dive into,
Sure.
what that means and kind of how you would advise people plan and prepare for disruptions?
Sure. So for many years in crisis response circles, in the crisis response industry, one of the guiding principles, if you will, paradigms was the black swan concept. And by that, I mean that the vast majority of swans are white. They are almost always white. When you see a swan, it's white. But 1 out of 1,000 is black. And what that came to mean is that when we think of this in a crisis response perspective, it's the idea that, we need to be prepared for that one occasional, out of the blue, surprising thing, the black swan event, as it came to be called. Recognizing that most of the time we can assume that things will go along the way we expect them to, but occasionally we may have to contend with a black swan. There has been a shift in the paradigm, in the perspective now, and instead of thinking about black swans, it's what's come to be called the gray rhino perspective, which is to say it doesn't matter what color the rhino is. I can look for pink rhinos. I can look for blue rhinos. It doesn't matter. The majority of rhinos are gray. And what's important to me is to find out how many rhinos are in my environment, and has it become a stampede? What am I going to do if and when the rhino comes through? And so it's a shift again from sporadic, occasional to I need to be prepared for this. I need to be ready for this. It's no longer an occasional thing. And so it challenges the idea of, and I think many of us, myself included, if I confess, have said over these last 3 years, I've said, when's it going to get back to normal? You know what? It's only we got to be getting back to normal. This thing has to have run its course, right? Normal. And if by normal, I mean the absence of challenge, the absence of crisis, the absence of disruption. Well, normal is a comfortable delusion. It is a nice thing to think about, but the fact is that the world has changed as it always has, as it always will. It's not as if we are in a unique period where change is now something brand new. As the old saying goes, the only constant in life is change. And so we have to be ready for that. And I say this next statement with, I want to be clear, I'm not in any way minimizing or trivializing the situations that people are going through, but this is the term that is used in crisis response circles, that we are in a position where we need to assume the boom. Assume the boom, which is to say, there was a time, again, if we think like the black swan perspective, well, the boom may happen. It may happen occasionally. It may not happen. We need to be ready, but, maybe it's not going to happen. And what are the odds? What are the odds that it's going to happen here? We need to assume it will happen here and that it's going to occur. And that why that is helpful, why that is significant, particularly for a business leader, why that changes things is that when we assume the boom, if we take the standpoint that, okay, something is going to happen, I don't have to necessarily know what exactly it is, but I need to know that something significant will occur. That changes things. Because prior to this, with the Black Swan approach, it was always left of boom. I would spend all my money, all my resources, all my energy in how do I prepare, how do I plan, how do I prevent the situation from occurring. And, when the boom happens, I really didn't have a plan afterwards. I just was, rolling the die and banking that, if we did enough preparedness, maybe it wouldn't get to there. When we take the assume the boom approach, when we are thinking about this in gray rhinos and saying there's going to inevitably be a stampede, we now focus our time, energy, resources on how do I mitigate the consequence? How do I make the bad less bad? How do I manage the after effects? And what plan do I have? I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to be making it up following a crisis like that, as if following a major event, I'm going to be highly creative and be able to think out of the box. No, I need to have a plan in place and then tweak that plan, adjust that plan to the reality of what happened. But I need to start by having a plan. And so it means that I give equal weight to left of boom and right of boom. I need to be ready to manage that. And as we began our presentation, a significant part of right of boom is how do I manage my people? How do I handle my team? How do I meet the behavioral and emotional needs of my employee group following this event? Because the strength of my company is going to depend on that. Being able to take care of them is going to help my business return to productivity that much quicker.
Yeah,
and frankly, it's the right thing to do.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's interesting to think about this concept. It's a very eye-opening thought and concept, and it makes sense. And kind of when we're talking about systemic disruption, all of these kind of the events that will just happen all the time, do these impact the workplace and kind of employees differently than a singular event? Or is it more impactful that more are happening?
I think what's occurring is that it's, to use an IT term, it's eating up the bandwidth of your employee group. That cumulative events, and particularly cumulative events that were not attended to, that were not addressed, that were not acknowledged, and in which resources were not directed, will simply, your team can probably take a hit and keep rolling. They can maybe take two and keep rolling, leading you to a false assumption that I think they're doing all right. But each time their bandwidth gets less, their capacity to respond and adapt shrinks and shrinks. And then it's inevitable that one of these events is going to overpower and overwhelm the group. It's not a question of looking at it and saying, well, I think everybody's doing all right. I think they're doing fine. I'm not hearing anybody complaining. I'm not seeing anybody upset and distressed in the hall. So I don't think they need resources. Let's keep rolling. And that is a mistake. That means instead of building a culture of health, instead of demonstrating that we are a company that cares and provides resources and responses for to help our employees manage, we're going to say we're only going to pay attention to it when it gets bad enough, when you're hurting enough, when things have impacted it that I can no longer ignore your pain and now I have to do something. That is not a winning strategy. That is not one that is going to endear the leader to the work group following an event. And so it's important to recognize that the cumulative effects of systemic, now if it is attended to, and if I respond to it appropriately, and if I attend to the emotional needs of my employees as well, that again builds culture, it builds resilience, it helps them realize, hey, if we handled this past event, I learned some things from it. I was perhaps surprised by how strong I am. I am pleasantly aware now that I can take things that I didn't think I could now that it's been tested, and I can bring that with me into the next event to the degree that time and space was allowed for me to manage it. So it is building the resilience, the hardiness, if you will, of your team when you respond to them appropriately through meeting their behavioral health needs following an event.
I think that's great. And I think kind of just to follow that up, and we're going to get into leadership in just a moment here, but just to follow that up, do you think that some types of, I mean, their disruptions could be anything. And like we mentioned at the beginning, they can impact people very differently. But is there any like singular disruptions that really impact a work environment, or does it just kind of depend on the, whatever that particular disruption is?
I think that's a great question, particularly because obviously in order to create examples that people can relate to and that are immediately I can wrap my mind around and say, okay, yes, that's a crisis. I have throughout the course of this, I've been, referencing large scale events. I've been talking about things like COVID, like civil unrest, like hurricanes and wildfires, things that we can undoubtedly and indisputably say, yes, those are clear crises. But it may surprise some folks to find out that the majority of responses that R3 Continuum manages and provides support for on a month-to-month basis, the majority of responses are unexpected employee death. And by that, I mean an employee that died perhaps by a heart attack over the weekend or an automobile accident on the way from home. These are powerful events, but they did not occur at the workplace. They did not occur in view of all the employees and everybody saw it. I mean, there are, again, situations where that does occur. I'm not denying that those things occur, but what I'm saying is that that kind of an event in which I said goodbye to a coworker on Friday and come back to work on Monday and find out, what? That coworker's never going to be here again? That might be seen as, well, that's upsetting, that's distressing, but I don't know if we really need to, put a response together or support the employees. I mean, that's a course of life event, right? And do we need to respond to it? But again, think about the bandwidth concept. When that occurs, that has a very powerful impact for that work group who worked with that employee. It's a very powerful impact for those in the company, perhaps those who are already carrying a burden of their own grief for other situations, for other events, other losses that are not necessarily tied to work. But if we stack that on top of it, and again, it's not managed and not given a care and an appropriate response, it drains the employees, drains them of their energy, of their bandwidth, their ability to respond, and leaves them less likely to respond to the next inevitable crisis. And so it's not a question of size that determines it. It's not a question of the incident itself that drives it. It's the impact on that work group. And a savvy leader knows that these situations have an impact, and I want to be ahead of it. I want to respond to it. I want to do the right thing and make sure my employees know that I care as a leader.
I love that, because I think you kind of hit on, people don't know necessarily the past. I mean, if your coworker passes away in an automobile accident and you're just finding out, and if you've had a traumatizing accident years ago, before you even joined the company, but people weren't aware of it, that might hit that employee much harder, kind of bring back memories of the terror and just the grief about it. So I think it's very important to think like that as well.
Well, and it is not something that I am just purporting just as, sort of my opinion that I think this is a good thing. This is what's called trauma-informed leadership. And it is a growing and very powerful influence in the business community right now, that particularly coming off of the last 3 years of all that we've been through as a country, as a globe, that a trauma-informed leader understands that and knows that their employees bring themselves to work every day, including their lived experiences, good and bad. And so a trauma-informed leader understands that that's going to be part of how I take care of my people.
I love that. And I think while we're kind of on that topic of leadership, kind of discussing what leaders can do. So not only do leaders have to, deal with the impact on their people and their organization, but they also are probably feeling this impact as well after following a disruption. So what is important for them to take time out to do or focus on to ensure that they're also taking care of their own well-being?
Yeah, I think what's key here is, that phrase, taking care of yourself is taking care of your employees, sounds sort of intuitive. And it's like, yeah, you know what? That makes sense. I'll do that. But the reality is when a crisis occurs, most leaders, they've achieved their position because they are problem solvers, because they are good at managing a problem. And so when a problem occurs, a crisis or a disruption strikes their workforce, they kind of go into problem solving mode. And they go into that sort of leader perspective where they're like, okay, I'm focused, I'm down, I got it, I'm going to take care of this, I'm going to manage my people, what do I do? Boom, boom, boom. And they often forget the last thing they do is care for themselves. And I want to be clear that it's not take care of myself first, it's take care of yourself too, as well. Take care of yourself as well. It's not, this is what is meant by leading by example. Your team is going to be looking for you. And if I am distant, if I am unmoved by it, because I think, if I were to be authentic or present in this moment and my team, saw me perhaps, moved by this event, whatever it might be, would they take that as a sign of weakness? So I can't dare to do that. I need to be tough. I need to be rock solid. I need to be, we're leaders. We're going to get through this. The sort of outdated John Wayne mode or Bruce Willis mode or, the Rock mode of handling a crisis, which is to say, never let them see you sweat. Nope. And there's nothing wrong with me. That is not leading by example. That is not authentic leadership. That is not being present for your people. When they see you be real and acknowledge that, yes, this event has power. And even if it's not necessarily impactful for you, but to be able to empathize with your team and say, I know how many of you were close to so-and-so if there's, for example, the death of an employee. I know how powerful this has impacted all of us. I know how this large-scale event has brought about concerns for your families as well. And we get that. And we want to be here and we're going to get through this together. And so being present, being authentic, but also caring for yourself is a way to demonstrate leading by example. And so for example, here's one very powerful way. When a leader requests one of our on-site specialists, our DEMS specialists, to come on-site and provide psychological first aid, provide emotional support for the employee group, a savvy leader says, and I'm going to be the first to take it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to be the first one to sign up because I want you to know, one, that I support it, two, I need it, and I assume you do too, and that I'm going to take advantage of this because I think this is the right resource to have on hand, and I hope you'll do the same. I tell you, when a leader does that, that opens the door because employees are like, well, I'm not sure. Should I take advantage of this? Is this something that's legit? And when a leader takes advantage and demonstrates sense, when they promote their employee assistance programs or other well-being resources, again, EAPs and well-being sort of, fluffy things or soft benefits, as they're sometimes called, that is part of building a culture. That is a reflection of a safe workplace, emotionally as well as physically safe workplace, a priority. And we're providing resources to care for you, our employees. That we're taking care of our people.
Yeah, I think I loved your point about having a leader, take advantage or DEM, because I think it helps to, and we've talked about it a lot in the past, but like there's a stigma around it of if the leader doesn't, am I going to, like, I need that help, but am I going to look weak in, my leader's eyes or my other employees' eyes if I take advantage of a service that would help? And I think when a leader steps up and is the one to, inform all the rest of the employees and say that they're taking it too, it helps kind of release that stigma as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so going on that, we've heard this question actually asked to us in the past, but what should leaders do each time something happens? So like, we talked about it, disruptive events happen quite frequently right now, all around the nation. And we hear about them, like you said, on the news all the time. But when should leaders, talk about it or send out a company-wide email, but, without feeling like a broken record or insensitive to a situation or anything like that?
Sure. So I think about that embedded in that question, and you're right, I've had leaders ask me that question before, is I think a mistaken notion. Again, they're like, oh, if this event happens and I express the company care or the company concern in an email or in a town hall meeting in which I view that, are they going to get tired of hearing about me? But when we think about systemic disruption, when we think about the fact that these things are building up, that's like saying, how often should I care? I see somebody get hurt multiple times. Should I care only the first time they get hurt, or should I care, the third time or every other time? If I step and I think back that every crisis is a human crisis, every disruption is a human disruption, it doesn't matter how often it occurs. It's important that I express my care as a leader, our care as a organization, that the company gets it as many times as is needed. The concern that it might be seen as a broken record is really a misnomer, because that's again like saying, well, I told you once I cared. I know you're hurt now by a different injury, but what I said before, that is not going to carry. They want to know that you get it now, and that you are authentic and care now.
Well, and so to follow that up, it sounds like, what are some common mistakes that leadership could do when navigating this constant disruption or disruption in general? It sounds like one of them may be not communicating. But are there other common mistakes that are made?
One tied to communication as well, is that some leaders, and it's on paper, this is a very solid concern. They're like, well, listen, I'm going to communicate to my team once I know all the facts. Once I have gathered all the information, an investigation has occurred, and I can send a communique out that, clears it all up, lets them know everything that's going on. And, while that sounds smart, that sounds pretty wise, I get that, particularly in today's culture of instantaneous communication, what that means is I have guaranteed I am going to be behind the 8 ball for the rest of this crisis, that I'm going to be chasing it, because first off, how much time will elapse before you actually know everything? What would that time be? And in that gap, in that intervening time, it's human nature that in the absence of real information, we will plug in our worst possible fears. If I don't hear from a leader early on, if a leader doesn't establish themselves as a consistent and reliable source of information, the rumor mill will take over. My assumptions of, well, maybe they don't have a plan. Maybe they don't care. Maybe, all of a sudden, all the negative assumptions are put in, and the judgments that are going to occur on the leadership is going to be tremendous. And so being able to respond immediately with an update. And so what I often say is communicate, and then communicate again. And that sounds like it's repetitive, obviously, but what I'm trying to say is you don't have to have all the facts. You don't have to have all the information. Even a message that says, we are aware that an event occurred at 2:00 in the, in warehouse A. We will find out more, and as we do, we will communicate that to you. That's great, because you've established, one, we're aware, two, we're taking steps, we've got a plan, and you can expect us to give you the information that you need. We are a trusted, viable source of information, because otherwise, you don't want Facebook's text, Instagram, and others to be the source of information that everybody's operating off of. And then as you gain new information, update. We've got new information. Here's what else we know. Here's what we're able to say and able to share. And so even if there are things that you can't share, for example, saying, there was a fatality, out of respect for the family members, we're not able to confirm who that is at this point until family has been notified. We trust you will understand and respect that. However, we do have to confirm that there has been a fatality. That kind of, again, message is as distressing as that is the right and appropriate kind of message to give, because it's updating people in real time, as opposed to saying, I heard it was so-and-so. I heard that there were two. I heard three. And, you being able to share the information you can, and acknowledge the information you can't share. We don't know the status at this point, but as soon as we do, we'll tell you more. Perfectly acceptable message. And that is one that allows you to communicate in a consistent fashion, because you are able to establish yourself as a reliable and trustworthy source of news early on. That's critical for a leader.
Yeah, and I think in like you were alluding to, in the days we are now, where Facebook, Twitter, everything is kind of the first place you go for news and information like that, especially if you're a larger company. I mean, it happens with smaller ones too, but that can spread like wildfire, and it's, you never know, and unless you're communicating, then those rumors will just continue to circle, and it's just typically not a very good look.
Exactly.
And so I think, again, this kind of goes great into the next, but like there could be leaders out there that are not aware of kind of the erosion that can happen when their organization lacks effective response to a disruption. So what is the cost to an organization of doing nothing?
Well, there's an interesting thing. There is research behind it. There's research that shows the difference between received and perceived support. Received and perceived. So received support is offered, and individuals take advantage of the support, whatever it is. They take advantage of it, and there is certainly there's a benefit that accrues from that, depending on the quality and how quickly it was offered, etc. But what the research showed, and this was rather surprising, is that perceived support, which is to say support is offered, and even if an employee chooses not to take advantage of it, they say, oh, support's there, but nope, I don't think I need that. There is, the research supports that there is an equal, if not greater, beneficial impact to simply knowing that support has been offered. And I contend that the theory behind that is that offering support allows an employee to self-assess, to evaluate and say, they've brought counselors on site. Do I need that? No, I think I'm doing well enough that I'm going to choose to do something else. I'm going to call my spouse or partner. I'm going to call a friend. I'm going to reach out to my therapist. Maybe I already have behavioral health support. I'm going to reach out to a faith mentor, or I'm going to go for a walk in the woods and do something to try and calm, whatever it might be. That by offering support, even if it's not taken advantage of, you've created the dynamic where an employee self-assesses and says they're doing well enough and that they're able to move past that. And that is a gain, even if they don't talk to the counselor. That is an expression of agency. To put it bluntly, it's the first positive choice following an event in which they had no choice. And so they are already moving ahead and taking the next right step, even if they don't see the counselor. But that can only happen if the resource is offered. If it's not offered, there will be a different perception, an entirely different perception, a perception that the company doesn't care, that the company is not providing support. And that is particularly important in the shifting workplace demographics today. So, for example, if I were, I'm dating myself, but I am, on the tail end of the boomer generation. And that when I entered this field, a majority of the employees were boomers. And when support was offered, they were always suspicious of it. There was, because of stigma, because of that demographic, and I'm painting this with a broad brushstroke, so please understand. But if I were to say that demographic would more likely react to behavioral health support being offered with suspicion. What has shifted in that intervening time is that millennials and Gen Z, that demographic that is entering the workforce and is inevitably increasing and becoming the dominant group, they're suspicious if it's not offered. They are going to say, wait a second, this thing happened. Why aren't resources being offered? That is a group that is far less concerned about stigma and far more concerned about appropriately meeting themselves with the right kind of resources. And so they're not worried if a counselor is offered. They'd be worried if one wasn't. And that would be seen as a negative of corporate culture. If this company doesn't care about me, why should I care about them? And so there is a very powerful cost to doing nothing.
I feel like it could easily lead to people leaving the organization because they don't feel like they're supported, or the buzzword that's going around now where, they're like, what, I don't want to do that extra work. I'm just they don't care about me. Exactly like what you said. They don't care about me. Why should I care about them? So I think that's so on this kind of this topic of, maybe you start assuming the boom. There's, how do you ensure that you are in a well-positioned spot to respond with speed and quality of care that's needed to effectively recover from a disruption if you hadn't experienced one before then?
Well, so let me suggest we go to the next slide, because I think that what's important for leaders to think about when they're creating a plan, when they're looking at their strategy, and it's important to know that their employee assistance programs can be key consultants in this and helping them shape that. And if a company doesn't have an EAP, that is one of the services that R3 offers, is that we can help with that consultation. But regardless where it comes from, the first thing that a leader needs to be aware of following the boom, the first thing they need to be aware of is that there are 5 areas of sort of universal concern, 5 areas that they should be paying attention to or thinking about how our policies, procedures, and protocols support these 5 areas. This is, again, based on research that is widely accepted. This is the most best practice approach to crisis response, called psychological first aid. And again, I want to be clear, I'm not asking a leader to be a therapist. I'm not asking them to be a social worker or a psychologist. But when we look at these 5 key elements, it doesn't require, I don't think, an advanced degree to be aware of and cognizant of how can we, first and foremost, establish safety. How do I communicate to my employee group that the event is over, we have restored control, we have restored calm, we have contained the crisis, and we are back to being safe? That is key, because until people feel safe, and that means emotionally as well as physically safe, that until the safety has been restored, there's no point in talking about anything else. There's no point in trying to process or discuss anything else. Safety is the key, and until I feel safe, I'm going to be on DEFCON 4 for the rest of the time. I am still thinking there's a threat in my environment. Why would I gear back down? But once safety has been restored, the next one is calmness, is being able to assist employees to be able to take that deep breath, to be able to say, okay, how do I regain control of my body again? How do I control my thoughts again, and take that deep breath and be able to regain focus and be able to tap into my resilience and the resources that I have around me with the strength and cohesion of my team. Be able to look at EAP resources and how they can help me, online resources and apps that can be helpful in restoring calmness. Next, connectedness. And I kind of referenced that earlier, the idea that research is quite strong that we recover better from a crisis together than we do alone. That being able to know that I am part of a team, part of a work group that went through this event and I am not walking this path alone, is indeed a supportive, protective factor that is useful and helps me to get through it. Knowing that I am connected at work and knowing that I have connections outside of work, reminding myself of family, friends, faith groups, community organizations, others that can help me feel like I am part of a group contending with this and we are walking together through this. I am not alone and isolated. That feeling of connectedness helps to be able to move forward with greater efficiency. Next, there's self-efficacy, or being able to return to the sense that, okay, while I couldn't have done anything to stop the crisis happened, the crisis occurred. Okay, I couldn't do anything to control that, but where it goes from here is up to me. I'm able to make the next right decision and the one after that and the one after that. I have agency again, helping them re-engage with that sense of competence, that I'm able to take the next right step. And for many employees, surprisingly, that next right step is returning to work, is being able to re-engage with my work. And it's not just, well, yeah, sure, that's a productivity outcome. And certainly that is, and that's beneficial for everyone. But returning to work is an expression of functional resilience. Employees following a crisis, particularly one at the workplace, want to return to something that is predictable, that is familiar. There is surprising power in the mundane. I want to be able to return to something in which I know what I'm supposed to do. When the crisis happened, I didn't know what to do. But my job, I feel confident of what I'm supposed to do on a daily basis. That helps me re-engage with that sense of I'm in control again, and I'm making decisions on my own behalf, my team's behalf, my family's behalf, or my community's behalf. And then finally, the last element for leaders to pay attention to is hope, is that sense of we can get through this. We are going to get through this. I think following the Boston Marathon bombing, do you recall what was the slogan that was quite, popular and prevalent following that?
I don't off the top of my head.
Well, fair enough. It was Boston Strong.
Yes,
Boston Strong.
Okay.
That was the sort of the motto, the rallying cry, if you will, Boston Strong. And it wasn't a denial that the bombing had occurred. It's not a denial or dismissal of the deaths and the injuries that occurred from that. It was an indication that we, as a city, Boston, will get through this. We are Boston Strong, and we will manage this. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about with hope. It's the kind of inspirational, aspirational aspect where a leader is able to help their organization see beyond the event and to say, listen, we will get through this together. We are, as a company, we are that kind of strong, and that we will be able to make this, and we're going to get through it as a group. We can support each other. So those 5 things, safety, calmness, connectedness, competence or self-efficacy, and hope or courage, as sometimes it's called, are the 5 elements that a leader should be thinking about.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And so when it comes to supporting employees' well-being, sometimes, like we talked about earlier, some leaders that aren't reaching out necessarily like normally or anything like that, but they think employees are doing just fine. But maybe that employee isn't doing very well. What can leaders do to remain connected to the overall behavioral health of their employees, particularly with systemic disruption being a normal challenge?
Yeah, I think it's in that change, in that shift from sporadic to systemic, I think it's important that employees or leaders, recognize that well-being is no longer a perk. It's an imperative. It is a key element, a key part of what they are seeking to inspire and inculcate in their employee group. Being able to well-being is not just a soft benefit and it's a nice thing to do. Well-being is the bedrock on which an employee group draws when they have to respond to a crisis. It's that emotional bank account that they withdraw from when a crisis happens. And if I'm not investing anything in that, if I don't, as a leader, proactively place well-being resources at the disposal of my employees, it may not show up today, it may not show up tomorrow, but when the chips are down, when the crisis occurs, then you'll see, then the cracks will occur, then they're going to be operating on empty. And so being able to, what I'm talking about is building a culture of health, of investing in your employees, not just because it's a good thing to do or it's an honorable thing to do, though those issues in and of themselves are true and worthy right there. Part of sustaining your organization. It's preparing for systemic disruption by saying, I want a work group that is as emotionally healthy, as well prepared. And so, because that is going to help my business withstand the next unexpected crisis. It's inextricably linked. Organizations and employees rely on each other. The employee and the employees look to the organization for support, resources, and leadership. There's an old phrase that says the strength of the pack is the wolf. And I think that continues to apply in a business setting. A company is only as strong as its employees and vice versa. In the well-being of your employees before the crisis happens is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do from a business perspective.
And I think talking like that is excellent to say, from your expertise and what you're seeing in the work of R3 Continuum and what they're doing and the future of disruption, what are workplaces likely to continue to see as we move into the next year and beyond as far as disruption is concerned?
Sure. So I think, for many organizations, it's important to acknowledge what these last 3 years have been like. The constant presence of successive waves of COVID, the impact and continuing impact of racial injustice and diversity, equity, and inclusion issues and how that impacts your workforce. Being prepared for perhaps crises that are connected to or driven to climate issues. So the increase in wildfires, the intensity of hurricanes, the increase in flooding events certainly have an impact on so many organizations and on their employees in those areas. And so it's important to be, again, it's not a question of if a crisis is going to happen. It's a question of when's it going to happen, how many are going to happen, and how long is this going to be. For a wise and savvy leader is again assuming the boom and is aware of and prepared for the inevitable crisis that's going to come. And so being able to have a plan that is solid and sustaining of their employees' well-being is a first step in having a business continuity strategy that's effective.
That wraps it up for our systemic disruption presentation today. So thank you all for joining us. Jeff, thank you very much for spending the time with us and talking about the impact of systemic disruption and how it truly impacts a work environment and what people can do to support their employees. But
thank
if you have
Shane. Thank you, Shane, and thank you to all who attended this and for your time and attention. Be well and stay safe.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.